dozens of rusted barrels hidden among the reeds. When he opened one, he immediately called 911. What the experts discovered later shocked the entire region. Subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're watching from, and share this video with your friends. The first light of dawn broke gently over the tree line, painting the surface of the river with soft reflections of gold and copper. Mist hung low above the water, drifting in slow ribbons that moved like living creatures over the still current. The sound of cicadas rose and fell, a steady pulse beneath the cries of distant birds. Somewhere beyond the bend, an egret flapped its wings and vanished into the pale horizon. Nathan Jones adjusted the straps of his old life vest and pulled the cord to start the motor of his patrol boat. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then caught, its quiet rumble echoing faintly across the banks. For more than 20 years, Nathan had served as a park ranger, and this place had become as familiar to him as the lines on his own palms. The national park stretched for miles, a maze of dense forest, marshy wetlands, and long channels where the river split into hidden arms. He knew where the beavers built their dams each spring, where the herons nested, and which trails the deer used when the heat grew unbearable. His mornings were always the same, slow, methodical, almost meditative. It was the repetition that kept him calm, the certainty that he belonged to this rhythm of earth and water. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. Nathan steered the boat towards the northern channel, where the current ran deeper and slower. The fog began to lift, revealing the mirrored reflection of cypress trunks rising from the water. Somewhere beneath the surface, fish stirred and flashed silver for a moment before disappearing again. Nathan reached for his binoculars, scanning the tree line for signs of illegal activity. During the summer months, some visitors ignored the park's restrictions. Campfires too close to dry brush, or worse, poachers setting nets along the banks. But this morning, everything seemed undisturbed, almost eerily still. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his metal thermos and checked his logbook. The route was standard. From the ranger station near Willow Point down to the old bend near Miller's Creek and back. He wrote down the time, the weather, the water level, small details that only another ranger would ever care about. He found comfort in those small notes, in the quiet bureaucracy of a man doing his duty. As he flipped the page, something caught his eye in the corner of his vision. At first, it was nothing. A flicker of light, a small reflection through the veil of fog. He squinted, focusing on the reeds along the far bank. There it was again. A sharp glint, the brief wink of sunlight on metal. It was too angular to be natural, too smooth. He frowned and adjusted his binoculars. The reflection came from a cluster of thick reeds near the curve of the channel, where he knew only waterfowl and turtles usually gathered. He slowed the engine, letting the boat drift closer. The sound of water lapping against the hull filled the air. Nathan leaned forward, scanning the spot. The fog thinned enough for him to see the shape clearly now, something round, dull, partially submerged beneath the weeds. It looked like a rusted drum or barrel, its surface mottled with orange corrosion. He frowned, uneasy. There were no industrial sites anywhere near this part of the park. The last time he'd seen barrels like that was decades ago, when floodwaters had unearthed old fuel containers from an abandoned logging camp. But this wasn't one or two. Through the reeds he could see more, faint outlines under the green curtain of plants. He felt the first small ripple of unease. The park was supposed to be a sanctuary, untouched, carefully maintained. Every inch of land here had been mapped, cataloged, and protected, and yet here, in one of the most remote corners of the reserve, stood something that didn't belong. Nathan cut the engine and let the boat drift silently. The silence deepened, pressing against his ears. He could hear the distant croak of frogs, the buzzing of insects, and beneath it all, the faint hiss of water moving between reeds. He pulled out his GPS tracker and marked the coordinates. The screen blinked slowly, confirming the point. His first thought was that someone might have dumped old fuel drums illegally, maybe from one of the nearby rural roads. It wouldn't be the first time people tried to save money by avoiding proper disposal. But even that didn't make sense. This stretch of river was too far from any access point, and the road that once led here had been closed off years ago after a landslide. He lifted his binoculars again and scanned the shoreline more carefully. The mist had lifted almost entirely now, revealing more of the metal shapes. There were many, dozens, maybe more, arranged haphazardly, half buried in mud, surrounded by moss and reeds. Some had rolled partly into the water. Their surfaces were coated with rust and algae, blending them into the natural scenery like relics of a forgotten age. Nathan felt a chill crawl down his neck. He had patrolled this river countless times. There had never been anything like this here. He steered closer, cutting the engine completely and using the paddle to guide the boat silently toward the spot. The water grew darker, thicker. He could smell the faint tang of decay, a mix of stagnant mud and something else, something metallic. When he reached the edge of the reeds, he tied the boat to a branch and stood carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the soft wood of the deck. He leaned forward, pushing the reeds aside with the paddle. A cluster of barrels stared back at him, their faded surfaces barely visible through the moss. For a long moment, he simply looked at them. The barrels were old, their sides eaten by time, but they had clearly been placed there deliberately. Some stood upright, others lay on their sides half covered by silt. It wasn't random. Someone had brought them here, perhaps even stacked them once before the water rose. His mind began to spin through possibilities, each one darker than the last. He stepped off the boat onto a small patch of solid ground. The mud sucked at his boots with each movement. Kneeling beside one of the barrels, he brushed away a layer of algae with his gloved hand. No labels, no markings, nothing to indicate what was inside. Only deep gouges where paint had peeled away. He tapped the metal lightly. It gave off a hollow, unhealthy sound. The sun broke through the mist, and for the first time that morning, he could see clearly how many there were. His breath caught. The bank stretched nearly 50 yards along the water, and everywhere he looked, more barrels emerged from the mud like corroded bones. They formed an irregular line that followed the curve of the river. There were too many to count. Nathan straightened slowly, his mind caught between curiosity and fear. He reached for his phone to take pictures, documenting everything. The camera clicked quietly, capturing each eerie detail. The shapes, the color, the way the river reflected their rusted surfaces like open wounds in the landscape. He zoomed in on a cracked lid, faint traces of red paint still visible around its rim. The paint had blistered and split as if eaten by some corrosive reaction. He told himself to think rationally. Maybe it was part of an old flood defense project, some long-forgotten attempt to reinforce the banks, or perhaps construction waste from before the park was established. But the timeline didn't match. The park had been federally protected for over 40 years. Nothing like this could have been buried or dumped without official records. And if it were old, he would have found them long ago. A dragonfly landed on one of the lids, its wings catching the light. For an absurd moment, Nathan felt a pang of guilt, as if he were intruding on something forbidden. He turned his gaze back to the water. A few small fish floated near the surface, moving sluggishly. He watched one of them turn sideways, belly flashing pale under the sunlight before sinking slowly out of sight. A cold unease settled over him. He could feel it in his stomach, a tightening sensation that told him something here was terribly wrong. His instinct, honed through years of emergencies and rescues, began to whisper that he should leave, report this, not touch anything until specialists arrived. But another part of him, the part that hated mysteries, that needed to understand, kept him standing there. He looked again at the cluster of barrels disappearing into the mud, then at the still water that lapped softly against them. Nothing moved except for a ripple spreading slowly across the surface. The air felt heavier now, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Nathan checked the time. He had already spent nearly an hour in this spot. The sunlight had climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of fog, and the humidity was rising. He decided he would come back with proper equipment and protective gear, maybe even call in a preliminary report to the district office. For now, he needed to mark the area thoroughly. He placed 2 orange flags on the shore and one near the waterline, then entered the coordinates again into his GPS. As he finished, a gust of wind passed through the trees, rustling the reeds. The metallic forms shifted slightly, creaking as if alive. A faint clinking sound came from beneath the water, and Nathan froze. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving inside the barrel cluster, perhaps another container dislodged by the current. He waited, listening. The sound came again, softer now, then faded. He exhaled slowly, aware that his pulse had quickened. He stepped back into the boat, untied the rope, and pushed off from the shore. The engine came to life with a low hum, and he steered back toward open water. The barrels disappeared behind the reeds, swallowed once more by the green stillness of the riverbank. As he moved downstream, Nathan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something floating after him. But the river remained calm, the surface unbroken except for the faint ripples from his wake. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that he was overreacting, that the barrels were simply remnants of old machinery or debris washed in from a storm. Still, the unease wouldn't leave him. When he reached the broader section of the river, the morning light had fully claimed the park. Everything shimmered in a deceptive calmness. Birds gliding, water shining, trees unmoving. Yet the image of those rusted drums lingered in his mind, refusing to dissolve. He noted one last thing in his logbook before heading back. Unidentified metal containers on northern bank. Investigate further. As he closed the book and turned the boat toward home, the reflection of the sun on the water momentarily blinded him, flashing just like the metallic gleam that had first caught his eye. He blinked, and the moment passed. The sound of the engine steadied. The park around him returned to its usual serenity, yet deep inside, Nathan sensed that something had shifted. The world he thought he knew so well had developed a flaw, small but spreading, like the first crack in a mirror before it breaks entirely. The next morning, the memory of the barrels refused to leave Nathan's thoughts. He had barely slept, his dreams crowded by images of rusted metal shapes glinting beneath murky water. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint shimmer of oil spreading like bruises on the river's surface. At dawn, while the sky was still violet and the crickets were fading into silence, he made the decision to return. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was a sense of responsibility, a quiet but insistent voice that told him he couldn't leave this thing unexamined. He moved through the ranger station in near silence, careful not to wake the others. The building, a simple wooden structure by the docks, creaked under his boots as he collected his gear. He packed his camera, GPS, test strips for the water, gloves, a respirator mask, and his old crowbar, its handle worn smooth from years of use. The river mist clung low when he stepped outside, and the air already carried a faint metallic tang that made his stomach tighten. He didn't know if he imagined it or if it was drifting all the way from that hidden bend. The motor sputtered to life reluctantly, and as the boat glided away from the dock, the station shrank behind him, swallowed by trees. The morning light broke in slivers through the branches, making the water sparkle like a sheet of broken glass. He followed the same route as yesterday, passing familiar markers, an old fallen oak that bridged the stream like a rib cage, a heron's nest perched in the crook of a cypress, the spot where deer often came down to drink. The park seemed as peaceful as ever, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something underneath the surface was wrong, that something foreign had invaded a place that was supposed to be pure. When he reached the channel's curve, the air seemed different. The smell was stronger now, faint but acrid, cutting through the usual wet sweetness of the river. He slowed the engine and guided the boat toward the reeds. The sound of the motor gave way to silence, broken only by the rhythmic splash of water against the hull. The same patch of overgrown vegetation stood before him, concealing the strange cargo beneath. He anchored the boat and stepped onto the muddy bank. His boots sank deep, and a faint suction noise followed every step. The barrels hadn't moved. They sat there as if they had been waiting for him, lined in uneven clusters, the morning dew glistening on their corroded shells. Some leaned against each other like exhausted soldiers, while others were half submerged in the thick mud. He counted at least 30 from where he stood, though the reeds concealed the rest. Their surfaces were covered in reddish flakes that fell away like old scabs when he brushed against them. A few still held faint streaks of blue and yellow paint, colors once bright but now ghostly and faded by decades of weather. He crouched near the nearest barrel and scraped away a layer of algae. The metal was soft in places, pitted and swollen from rust. His gloved fingers found what might once have been lettering, but the marks were too eroded to read. He took several photos, zooming in on the textures, the corrosion, the shapes of the lids. The camera clicked repeatedly, its sound strangely loud in the quiet. The air hung heavy, unmoving, as if even the forest was watching him. Nathan straightened and walked slowly along the line of barrels, documenting each one. He noticed faint tire tracks in the mud, half erased by time, but still visible to a trained eye. Someone had brought these here deliberately. The depth of the grooves suggested a heavy vehicle, perhaps a truck with large industrial tires. He followed the trail a few steps inland and found where the ground was flattened, as if something massive had been dragged through the underbrush. Branches were broken at odd angles, and there were shallow trenches filled with stagnant water. He returned to the riverbank and knelt again beside another barrel. The lid was dented inward, its seal cracked. He hesitated, gripping the crowbar. His instincts told him not to touch it. Protocol demanded he wait for hazardous materials teams, but the rational part of his mind argued back. Without knowing what was inside, no one would take his report seriously. A handful of photographs meant little in a bureaucratic chain of command. He needed proof. He slid the crowbar under the rim and pressed down. The lid resisted at first, then gave way with a low groan. A puff of air escaped, carrying a smell so sharp it burned his throat. Nathan jerked back, covering his mouth through the respirator, but the odor still forced its way in. It was chemical, sweet and bitter at once, like burning plastic mixed with something rotten. His eyes watered. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, landing in the mud with a dull thud. He forced himself to look inside. The barrel was half filled with a dark, viscous liquid. It looked like oil at first, thick and glistening black, but when he tilted his head slightly, it shimmered with rainbow hues: blue, green, purple, like gasoline on wet asphalt. A faint heat seemed to rise from it, though the air around him was cool. He could hear a soft popping noise from inside, as if something beneath the surface was slowly releasing gas. A single drop of the substance slid down the side of the barrel and landed on the ground. The grass beneath it wilted instantly, curling into black threads. Nathan stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He could feel a faint burning sensation on the exposed skin of his wrist where a droplet had touched him earlier when he brushed the lid. It itched fiercely, and a red mark began to bloom. He closed the lid as best he could, pressing it down with a piece of cloth between his hands. The edge wouldn't seal completely, but it was enough to stop the immediate release of fumes. He took several more pictures, this time of the liquid itself and of the dying grass. Then he turned toward the river, inhaling deeply to clear his lungs. The taste of metal lingered on his tongue. The sun had climbed higher, and through the haze he could see the full stretch of the side. There were far more barrels than he'd thought. Dozens lined the slope of the bank, half hidden under roots and vines. Some were dented, others pierced by small holes that oozed the same black substance into the mud. Thin trails of it seeped down toward the water, staining the soil in dark veins. Nathan's hands trembled as he took another water sample. He dipped a small tube into the river a few meters away, sealed it, and labeled it carefully. The water looked clean, but he knew better than to trust appearances. A thin, almost invisible sheen floated on the surface, catching the sunlight in pale iridescence. He crouched and touched it lightly with a gloved finger. The film broke apart but left an oily residue that refused to wash off. As he stood, something moved in the corner of his vision. He turned sharply. A small bird lay motionless near the reeds, its wings half open. The feathers were clumped together, stuck by moisture or oil. Flies had already begun to gather. A few feet away, a dead fish drifted in the shallows, its body pale and bloated. Nathan's chest tightened. He had seen the effects of contamination before, but never here. Never in the park he had sworn to protect. He stepped back toward the boat, his mind racing. It was clear now that whatever was in those barrels was leaking, and that it was deadly. The thought of it spreading through the waterways, poisoning everything downstream, made his stomach twist. He looked again at the endless rows of corroded drums, and a terrible realization struck him. If just one leaking barrel could kill fish and birds in hours, what would hundreds of them do? The air around him felt heavier, thicker. He suddenly felt dizzy, his head pounding. Whether it was the fumes or panic, he couldn't tell. He climbed quickly into the boat and sat down, trying to steady his breathing. For a moment, the only sound was the shallow slap of water against the hull. Then, from somewhere within the reeds, a hollow metallic noise rang out, a faint clinking, like one barrel shifting against another. Nathan froze. The sound came again, closer this time, as if something beneath the water was pushing the drums. He looked at the river's surface. A ripple spread slowly, disturbing the reflection of the sky. The barrels creaked again, metal rubbing against metal. It could have been the current, or perhaps the release of trapped air, but the timing felt deliberate, almost alive. A chill ran through him. He untied the rope with trembling hands, started the engine, and backed the boat away from the shore. The ripples followed for a few seconds, then disappeared as he reached deeper water. He didn't look back right away. Only when he was halfway down the channel did he allow himself a glance over his shoulder. The bank looked unchanged, the reeds swaying gently in the breeze, the rusted shapes barely visible now, but the stench lingered, faint yet unmistakable, a promise of something festering in the heart of the park. Nathan steered toward the main river, pushing the throttle slightly harder than usual. His reflection wavered on the surface, distorted by the boat's wake. He flexed his wrist, the skin now an angry red patch that throbbed with each heartbeat. He made a mental note to disinfect it immediately once he got back, though he doubted any simple antiseptic would be enough. As he approached open water, the sunlight grew harsher, and the park once again appeared calm and beautiful, as if the corruption behind him were only a dream. But Nathan knew better. He had seen the truth now. Something toxic had been dumped into this land, something that didn't belong in the natural order. He could still feel the faint tremor of the barrel's movement in his bones, like an echo that wouldn't fade. He reached for his radio, hesitated, then switched it on. The signal crackled faintly. He reported his coordinates and requested that an environmental response team be dispatched for potential hazardous material. His voice was steady, but his heart raced. As he ended the transmission, a heavy silence settled around him again. The river stretched endlessly ahead, but behind him in the hidden bend, the rusted shore remained, a wound in the landscape, festering in the heart of paradise. Nathan didn't know it yet, but that morning would mark the beginning of a chain of events that no one could stop once they were set in motion. The barrels were only the surface of something much deeper, something buried not just in the mud, but in the greed and neglect of years past. As he guided his boat back toward the station, he felt the eyes of the forest upon him, silent and patient, waiting for what would come next. By the time Nathan returned to the ranger station, the mark on his wrist had turned from red to a deep, irritated purple. The skin burned when he touched it, and tiny blisters began to form along the edge of the irritation. He washed it under running water until the sensation dulled, but the burning never quite faded. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the antiseptic from the first aid kit. He poured the clear liquid over the wound, watching it hiss faintly on contact. A small puff of steam rose from his skin, and he gritted his teeth against the pain. Something in that barrel had been alive in the chemical sense, reactive, volatile, dangerous. He didn't know what kind of compound could still be that potent after years, maybe decades, sealed underground, but it wasn't something nature should have to swallow. He logged his preliminary report as best he could, entering coordinates, visual descriptions, and photos into the park's environmental incident database. He attached a note marked urgent, requesting immediate attention from State Environmental Services. Yet, even as he filled out the digital forms, he knew the procedure would be slow. Reports like this always moved through layers of bureaucracy before anyone took real action. Somewhere, a manager would flag it for review, a clerk would schedule a call, and a regional office would discuss budgetary feasibility before sending a small team weeks later. By then, whatever was leaking into the water might already have spread downstream. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Outside, the wind was rising, and through the open window he could hear branches scraping against the side of the building. The air carried a faint odor, sharp, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably the same. He felt it in the back of his throat before he recognized it with his nose. That metallic sweetness again, thinner now, stretched by distance. The contamination was moving. Nathan stood, grabbed his field radio, and headed outside. The sky had turned a flat gray, the kind of washed-out light that dulls all colors. He looked toward the water, and his stomach clenched. The river's surface near the dock shimmered faintly. It wasn't as pronounced as what he'd seen upriver, but there was a delicate rainbow gleam spreading slowly outward. The oily film had traveled far faster than he'd expected. He moved quickly to the supply shed and pulled out a set of orange warning signs, small metal placards meant for emergencies like toxic spills or unsafe trails. He planted several along the docks, even though he knew it was useless until the higher-ups gave formal authorization. Still, it was something. He couldn't stand the idea of local fishermen launching their boats here without warning. The radio on his belt crackled faintly. He lifted it, trying to tune through the static. The reception was poor this deep in the park, but he finally caught the dispatcher's voice from the county emergency network. "Station 6, this is Central. Go ahead." "Central, this is Ranger Jones at Willow Point," he said, his voice rough. "We have a confirmed chemical presence in the northern channel. Coordinates logged. Possible hazardous waste contamination. I repeat, confirmed leakage from multiple barrels." There was a pause, just the crackle of interference, before the voice returned. "Copy, Jones. Dispatching hazmat unit from North District. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. Recommend securing perimeter and limiting exposure." "Understood," Nathan said, though the pit in his stomach deepened. 6 hours was a long time in a situation like this. 6 hours for toxins to spread, for wildlife to die, for wind and rain to carry invisible particles into the soil. He spent the next hour walking the perimeter near the river, checking for visible signs of impact. At first, everything looked the same: the trees, the reeds, the water. But as he moved closer to the bend, the changes became undeniable. Patches of vegetation near the shore were turning brown, as if touched by frost, though it was late summer. The bark on some of the lower trees was darkened, almost scorched. Frogs that normally hid among the reeds lay still on the mud, their bodies stiff and glistening. He stopped when he saw the first ripple. It began at the far edge of the channel, spreading slowly across the surface like the breath of something waking beneath. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. He followed the movement with his eyes, tracing it to the area where the barrels lay hidden. Then came the smell again, thicker, stronger. His vision blurred slightly, and his lungs tightened. He pulled his mask over his face, but it barely helped. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but another part of him, the stubborn, disciplined part that had spent decades dealing with floods, fires, and storms, forced him forward. He climbed back into his boat, steering cautiously toward the bend. As he drew closer, the air became heavier, almost humid with invisible fumes. The scene hadn't changed much since the morning, but now, under the dimming sky, it looked different, more sinister. The barrels gleamed faintly through the reeds, slick with moisture and streaked with fresh rust. Several had shifted slightly, likely from the river's subtle current or the gas building inside them. One barrel, half submerged in the mud, was slowly tilting forward, the seal at its rim bubbling faintly. He brought the boat closer, his gloved hand gripping the side. He could hear it now, the faint hiss of air escaping from inside the damaged barrels. Every few seconds one would emit a soft gurgle, releasing a thin stream of dark liquid that trickled into the mud. The black substance spread in slow tendrils, merging into a shallow puddle. The puddle rippled once, though there was no breeze. Nathan turned on his camera and began recording. "Willow Point, North Channel, 3rd Sector," he said quietly, documenting the situation for the record. His voice shook slightly. "Multiple containers compromised, active leakage, unknown compound exhibiting corrosive properties, immediate containment required." He crouched to get a closer angle, and that's when he noticed the reflection in the puddle. At first, he thought it was just his own silhouette distorted by the sheen, but as he leaned closer, the surface seemed to shift on its own, distorting the mirrored image of his face into strange patterns. The rainbow film on the water moved independently of the wind, swirling as if reacting to his presence. For a moment, his stomach turned cold. He blinked, shook his head, and the image was gone. Only his reflection remained. He told himself it was the fumes, the lack of oxygen, fatigue, but something deep in his gut told him to leave now, to run. He stood abruptly, swaying slightly from dizziness. The air around him shimmered faintly, as though he were standing in heat haze. His vision darkened at the edges. He stumbled back toward the boat, nearly tripping over a half-buried barrel. The impact sent a low metallic echo through the ground, and the nearest lid popped upward with a sharp hiss. A jet of gas escaped, carrying the full stench of whatever lay inside. The smell was unbearable: ammonia, burnt rubber, and something sour like decomposed flesh. Nathan gagged, coughing hard enough to make his chest ache. He dropped his camera and fumbled for his phone, trying to dial 911 directly this time. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind spinning. The call connected after 2 rings. 911, "What is your emergency?" a calm voice answered, far away and detached. "This is Ranger Nathan Jones," he gasped between breaths. "I need immediate hazardous response at Willow Point National Park, North Channel. Multiple toxic leaks, active chemical spill, possibly dioxin-based. I'm losing visibility. Air's contaminated. Sir, are you in immediate danger?" "Yes. The barrels are venting. Wildlife's dying." He broke off, coughing violently. His eyes burned, his throat raw. "Please send help. I can't contain this alone." "Stay calm, sir. We're dispatching emergency responders and notifying environmental safety. Do not approach the source. Find clean air and remain on the line if you can." He nodded reflexively, though the dispatcher couldn't see him. The phone felt slippery in his hand. He managed to make it back to the boat and collapsed onto the bench, dragging in shallow breaths. He started the motor, guiding the vessel downstream with trembling fingers. The current felt slower than before, as though the river itself were thickening. Behind him, the sound of hissing metal continued, rising and falling like a grotesque rhythm. A few bubbles broke the surface of the water, releasing more of that oily residue that caught the fading light in sinister hues. Nathan forced himself not to look back. The burning in his lungs eased slightly as he moved farther from the source, but his skin still prickled and his vision swam. He splashed river water over his arms and neck, though he knew the contamination had already entered his body through that small burn on his wrist. When the signal on his phone flickered, he realized the call had dropped. He didn't bother redialing. Help was on the way now, or at least he hoped so. He focused on steering, on keeping the boat straight. The air grew clearer the farther he went, until the familiar smells of the forest began to return. Wet earth, pine sap, distant smoke from a campfire somewhere downstream. But those comforting scents now felt foreign, as if he'd left one world and entered another. He reached the dock and stumbled onto solid ground, leaving wet footprints on the wooden planks. His head pounded. The wound on his wrist had grown darker, ringed by faint greenish veins that traced up toward his forearm. He grabbed the first aid kit again, soaked a bandage in antiseptic, and wrapped it tightly. The motion steadied him a little, though his heart continued to race. The sky was deepening toward dusk now, the light fading fast. The first insects of the evening buzzed in the distance, unaware of the poison that crept closer to their fragile ecosystem. Nathan sat heavily on the dock, his breath slowing. He stared at the river, calm and indifferent once more. The surface glowed faintly orange in the sunset, hiding the spreading contamination beneath. He thought about the call, about the tone of the dispatcher's voice. Professional, neutral, distant. They would send help, yes, but it would take time. Maybe too much time. He imagined the barrels continuing to leak through the night, the liquid seeping deeper into the soil, carried silently into the heart of the park. The animals would drink from it. The fish would die first. The birds would follow. He felt a tremor of helpless anger. For 2 decades he had protected this place from hunters, wildfires, and storms. But this was something different. This was invisible and merciless, something man-made, something that didn't belong in the chain of life he'd sworn to defend. He clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms. In the distance, he thought he heard a faint echo, sirens maybe, carried by the wind. But as the sound faded, he realized it was only the rush of the river, constant and ancient, moving on as if nothing had happened. The water carried everything away, secrets and poison alike, into the dark. Nathan rose slowly, his body heavy, his lungs aching. He turned toward the station lights flickering on behind him. Inside, he would prepare his full report, send every photo, every detail, every warning he could, and if the system failed to respond in time, he would find another way. Because something in that black liquid had changed everything. It wasn't just a spill, it was a wound in the land, and he was the only one who had seen it bleed. The ranger station stood quiet in the early evening, its exterior bathed in a dull orange glow from the setting sun. The wood-paneled walls, worn with age and softened by moss in the corners, had seen their share of fires, floods, and storms, but nothing quite like this. Nathan sat hunched over his desk, the soft whir of the old ceiling fan above barely stirring the stale air. His hands moved with methodical urgency across the keyboard as he typed up a more formal version of the incident report. He included coordinates, photographic evidence, environmental descriptions, and a detailed timeline of his observations and symptoms. His wrists were damp with sweat, and the bandage on his right arm had already soaked through, stained with an ugly gray ring of fluid that refused to dry. The signal from the radio remained silent. The last he'd heard was an assurance that a hazmat team had been dispatched and would arrive before midnight. That was hours ago. The park, vast and sparsely monitored, felt endless in moments like this. He felt the sheer weight of its isolation pressing down on him. Even with the station's networked systems and emergency channels, he might as well have been on another planet. As twilight deepened, Nathan stepped outside, seeking relief in the cooling air. He walked slowly down the worn path to the dock. The river flowed quietly, the oily sheen now barely visible under the fading light. He dipped a long branch into the water near the edge and stirred it slowly. Thin ribbons of iridescent film swirled outward from the motion. The contamination was no longer just sitting in one place. It was moving, breaking down, becoming something even more dangerous. Behind him, the soft crackle of tires over gravel signaled the arrival of another ranger. Daniel, the youngest on their small team, with barely 2 years in the service. He stepped out of his dusty SUV with a relaxed gait, unaware of what waited for him. "Evening, Nate," he called. "Got your message. That spill real? The photos looked bad, man, but I figured maybe just runoff from the old trail. Some busted septic or sump tank. Didn't think it was chemical. Nathan didn't respond right away. He motioned for Daniel to follow him to the river's edge. As they walked, the older man explained what he had seen. The barrels, the black liquid, the smell, the wildlife already showing signs of poisoning. He described the effect it had on his body, the dizziness, the burning, the tightness in his chest. Daniel's expression darkened with each detail. When they reached the dock, Nathan pointed to the surface. Daniel leaned in and squinted. At first, he shrugged, unimpressed. But as the younger ranger dipped his fingers into the water and brought them back up, the thin film clung to his skin like a second layer, refusing to drip away. He sniffed it once and recoiled. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Nathan replied, "but it's spreading." Back at the station, they ran the sample through the park's rudimentary test strips, usually used to measure pH levels and common pollutants. The strip turned black within seconds of contact. The results made no sense. The chemical levels were off the charts, far beyond anything they had encountered before. Whatever was in those barrels wasn't just industrial waste. It was something worse. Daniel began pacing the room, his face pale. "What do we do? The local kids fish from the southern pier every weekend. The scout group is supposed to camp here next week. This stuff's already in the water. How far down is it going?" Nathan opened his logbook and pointed to the downstream map. The river wound past several unmonitored zones before eventually joining a larger body of water used by local farms for irrigation. If the contamination reached that far, the impact would be catastrophic. "We need to get ahead of it," Nathan said. "We post warnings. We shut down access to the park. We contact local authorities directly. No more waiting." Within the hour, the station was transformed. Bright orange hazard tape stretched across the main trails leading to the river. Signs marked "Do Not Enter, Chemical Hazard" were staked into the ground. Daniel took the station's truck and began canvassing nearby fishing spots and access roads, taping up every entrance with warnings. But the panic didn't start at the signs. It began when a family of campers returned to the ranger station with their dog cradled in a blanket. The animal was trembling, foaming slightly at the mouth. They said it had been swimming in one of the creeks branching from the main channel. Nathan examined the dog's fur and found the same iridescent sheen clinging to it. Its heartbeat was erratic, its breathing shallow. They rushed the dog into the small medical room behind the station and called the nearest veterinary clinic. The news traveled quickly. By morning, the phones rang non-stop. Locals reported strange smells, dying fish, and birds falling from trees. A few fishermen called to report skin rashes after handling their catches. One elderly man claimed his well water had taken on a bitter taste. The entire district began to stir. The mayor's office contacted Nathan, requesting clarification on what was happening in the park. News outlets started asking questions. Then came the worst call yet. A mother, sobbing on the other end of the line, said her 2 children had been playing along the bank near Miller's Creek the previous day. Now they were both running fevers, complaining of stomach pain and dizziness. Nathan's hands clenched around the receiver as he gave her the number to emergency services and told her to demand blood testing. He knew then that containment had failed. Whatever lines had existed between the isolated spill and the outside world were gone. The park was no longer a sealed ecosystem. It had become the center of an unfolding crisis. The hazmat team still hadn't arrived. The promised 6 hours had stretched into 10. Nathan's emails to the environmental office bounced back with generic auto-replies. Daniel returned from the field with his face covered in sweat and worry. He said people were beginning to gather near the southern fence, demanding answers. Nathan stepped outside, his uniform stained with mud and sweat, and faced the dozen or so locals behind the yellow tape. Farmers, boaters, parents, all with the same questions in their eyes. What happened? Why didn't we know sooner? Is it in our water? Is it in our food? He didn't lie. He told them a chemical spill had been discovered, that the barrels had been dumped illegally, that the contents were still being analyzed, that they were taking every measure to contain it. But none of it felt like enough. One man shouted from the back, "You knew yesterday and waited till today to tell us?" Nathan nodded grimly, "Because I needed to be sure. And now I am." Another man stepped forward, holding up a dead duck wrapped in plastic. "This was on my property this morning. My kids feed these animals. I want someone held accountable." Nathan took the duck gently and placed it in a secure container. He told the man he'd make sure it got tested. But the eyes staring back at him weren't satisfied with promises. They wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Nathan felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He returned to the station and sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the emergency radio. The air outside was no longer still. Wind swept through the trees, and with it came the faint, acrid scent of something wrong. Daniel paced in the hallway, muttering to himself about lawsuits, media coverage, evacuations. Nathan heard none of it. His focus was locked on the river, on the idea that if the wind carried the fumes this far, it could carry them farther, on the knowledge that the birds flying out of the park could spread contaminants, that the rain forecasted for tomorrow might push the black liquid deeper into the soil, poisoning it for years. The situation had surpassed any single ranger's capacity. It was no longer about enforcement or protocol. This was a full-blown ecological disaster, and they were alone at the center of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park into shadow once more, Nathan stood at the window and watched the silhouettes of trees sway in the wind. He could almost see the barrels again in his mind, lined up like tombstones, their lids shifting in the dark, releasing their breath into the lungs of the earth. He whispered to no one in particular. This was supposed to be a sanctuary. But the silence offered no reply. Only the wind moved, carrying with it the first wave of panic that had already taken root in every life the river touched. The night brought no rest. Inside the ranger station, Nathan lay on the narrow cot in the back room, eyes wide open, his body aching, lungs tight from the fumes that still seemed to cling to the walls. A single light bulb buzzed overhead, casting a faint orange glow over the maps and gear scattered across the small desk by the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees whispered with a persistent, mournful rustle. Every so often, a branch would knock softly against the side of the building, a steady, ghost-like tapping that kept him from slipping into sleep. The events of the day churned through his thoughts like debris in a storm-swollen river. The family, with the sick children, the dead duck, the growing crowd of frightened residents, the oily gleam still crawling across the water's surface, and always the barrels, their shapes seared into his memory, corroded steel hulks exhaling death into the heart of the park. He could almost hear them from here, creaking and shifting in the mud, their dark contents slithering slowly into the soil. At some point before dawn, Nathan finally rose. The world outside the window was still cloaked in shadow, but the horizon had begun to blush with the first pale hints of morning. In that liminal light, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. What they had done so far wasn't enough. Warnings had been issued, officials notified. The hazmat team was allegedly en route, but Nathan no longer believed in waiting for others. Time was slipping through their fingers, and the contamination was gaining ground. He had to find out where the barrels came from, how they got here, and, most importantly, who had put them there. Daniel stirred as Nathan pulled on his boots. The younger ranger had fallen asleep at his desk, surrounded by empty water bottles, half-eaten protein bars, and a pile of handwritten notes. He looked up groggily, blinking. "You heading out again?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I need to see something," Nathan replied without slowing. "I think I know where this started." Daniel stood and rubbed his face. "Want backup?" "Stay here. Keep monitoring the radios. If hazmat finally shows up, take them to the barrels. I'll check in every 30 minutes. Nathan grabbed his field pack and stepped outside into the damp air. The sky was streaked with gray, the sun still hidden behind a wall of mist rising off the river. The trees were motionless now, their earlier murmurs silenced by the stillness that came just before full light. He moved quickly, taking a narrow dirt path that wound along the northern edge of the park. It was one of the oldest maintenance routes, overgrown in places and long unused. Few people knew it still existed. He followed the river upstream, carefully watching the ground. The mud near the bank showed subtle signs: small tracks, disturbed leaves, deep ruts pressed into the soft earth. At first, it was nothing more than a hunch, a vague memory of an old service road that once led to a now-defunct logging camp. But, as he continued, the signs grew clearer. Near the first bend, he found a set of tire impressions, not fresh, but not yet erased by rain or wind. They were wide, heavy, the kind left by industrial-grade trucks, and they led away from the water toward a thicket of young pines. He paused, crouched low, and ran his fingers along the edge of one track. The soil was compacted unnaturally deep, suggesting a heavy load. The pattern of the treads was distinct, sharply cut into the ground, a design he didn't recognize from any park-issued vehicle. He stood and followed the tracks. They snaked through the underbrush, past a rusted-out fence nearly swallowed by vines. The remnants of a faded sign clung to one of the posts. It had once read, "Restricted Access Department Use Only," but the words were nearly illegible beneath the corrosion and moss. Beyond it, the ground flattened out into what had once been a service yard. The clearing was choked with overgrowth, but Nathan could still make out the skeletal remains of old infrastructure. Concrete foundations cracked and sagging under the weight of decades. A half-collapsed metal structure with torn siding that flapped in the breeze like old skin. Rusted barrels lay scattered here too, some upright, others knocked on their sides. Most were empty, but a few had stained the earth around them with black halos. Nathan moved slowly, stepping over coils of brittle wire and warped metal debris. He pulled his mask tighter over his face as the chemical scent intensified. Near the far end of the yard, he found what he was looking for: a loading ramp leading into the shell of a warehouse. The doors had long since fallen off their hinges. Inside, the air was thicker, heavier. A fine dust coated everything, and the smell was suffocating, a mix of oil, mold, and something acrid that curled his nose. Sunlight filtered in through holes in the roof, casting pale beams across rows of stacked pallets. Some were empty, others bore dark stains. A few still held containers, blue plastic drums, steel cylinders, and battered boxes wrapped in industrial tape. Nathan moved closer, taking photos, inspecting labels. Most had been scraped clean, but one bore a partial shipping code burned into the side. A string of numbers, followed by ACX Chemical. He took a mental note. In the corner of the warehouse, he discovered a small office, the door hanging from one hinge. Inside, the floor was strewn with broken glass, scattered paperwork, and the remnants of rodent nests. He found a file cabinet tilted on its side, drawers half open. Most of the documents were damp and rotted beyond recognition, but in the back of the bottom drawer, wrapped in plastic, he found a stack of manifests. He carefully unwrapped them, flipping through yellowed pages covered in smudged ink and faded stamps. The company names meant nothing to him, mostly defunct contractors and shell corporations, but the destination addresses were clear. Several listed North Channel Drop Zone, WP Site 3. His stomach turned. WP stood for Willow Point. This place had been used as a dumping ground under cover of night and neglect, hidden in plain sight. He took photos of the documents, stuffed them into his pack, and turned to leave. As he crossed back through the warehouse, he paused near one of the intact barrels. It looked newer than the others, less rusted, less battered. He leaned closer. Its cap had been twisted partially open. A trickle of dark fluid ran down the side, pooling beneath it. He could see the floor beneath the puddle. Concrete turned brittle, cracked like scorched earth. A sudden sound made him freeze, a faint metallic clatter echoing from deeper within the building. He turned, heart pounding. Another barrel, possibly shifting from pressure or rot, or someone else. He waited, listening. The silence returned, thicker than before. He didn't linger. Whatever this place was, it was not empty, and he had what he needed. Outside, the wind had returned, stronger now. He followed the tracks in reverse, moving faster than before. His limbs ached, the wound on his wrist throbbing with each step. The edge of the woods was darker than it had been an hour ago, the clouds overhead thickening with the promise of rain. When he reached the path along the river, he stopped to catch his breath. The water below him was changing. The film had grown wider, spreading toward the southern bends. He saw dead fish clustered near the bank, their silver bodies flashing in the light. A heron stood nearby, motionless, staring at the water as if waiting for it to speak. Nathan felt the weight of everything settle on his shoulders, the proof of negligence, the evidence of hidden crimes, and the spreading ruin now seeping into every corner of the land. Back at the station, Daniel met him at the gate, eyes wide. He looked shaken. "You need to hear this," he said, holding out the radio. Local dispatch picked up a call from the town. They're saying kids are getting sick. More animals turning up dead. The news is catching on. People are scared, Nate. They want to know who did this. Nathan looked past him toward the river. In the distance, a single bird flew low over the trees, circling, then vanished into the mist. "I think I have an answer," he said, "but they're not going to like it." He stepped inside, dropped his pack on the table, and began laying out the evidence. Photos, documents, notes. Daniel watched silently as the pieces came together, forming a picture too grim to ignore. The source was clear. The perpetrators, though hidden behind shell names, were traceable. It had all been dumped here on purpose under the assumption that no one would ever find out. But they had miscalculated. Nathan wasn't finished. Not yet. Because now he knew where the poison came from, and he had every intention of exposing it. The black liquid had tried to seep quietly into the roots of the park, but it had stirred something just as dangerous in him. A fire that refused to be buried no matter how deep the mud. By the time Nathan finished organizing the materials he had recovered from the abandoned site, the sky outside had turned a murky slate. Rain was inevitable. The air had shifted again, heavier now, thick with the smell of coming storms and something more acrid beneath it. Faint, but unmistakable, like scorched metal soaked in vinegar. A low-pressure system had rolled in from the west and the temperature dropped fast, as if the forest itself were bracing for what was still to come. Inside the ranger station, everything was quieter than usual. Even the birds seemed to have vanished, their calls replaced by long pauses of unnatural stillness. Nathan stood by the window for a long moment, watching the trees sway gently, listening for something he couldn't name. The radio on the desk behind him crackled faintly, but offered no voices. The emergency channel remained open, yet silent. There had been no update from the hazmat team, no confirmation of arrival, no acknowledgement of his last transmission. For all intents and purposes, they were still alone. Daniel sat at the far end of the room, head bowed over a notepad. His usual energy was gone. He hadn't said much since Nathan returned from the warehouse, only nodded grimly when presented with the evidence. Photos of stained pallets, half-empty drums, shipping manifests with dead company names. Daniel was young, still new to the grim weight of accountability. This was his first real crisis, and it was already spiraling into something bigger than he'd imagined. He looked up now, eyes shadowed and tired. "Still no word?" he asked. "Nothing," Nathan replied. "They're either stuck, ignoring us, or choosing not to answer." Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose. "People are starting to talk. I saw a post online. Someone shared one of your river photos, tagged it with toxic leak and cover-up." Nathan didn't respond. He turned away from the window and moved back to the desk where he had spread out everything he'd gathered. He had taken the most important items from his field pack and arranged them like puzzle pieces. Printed stills of the leaking barrels, water test strips blackened from contamination, the partially legible shipping code, the altered manifests. Each document was proof of something that no one wanted to believe, that the poison in the river had a human origin, one carefully hidden under layers of silence and neglect. He picked up the broken file that bore the faded name ACX Chemical and stared at it. The name meant nothing to the public. It didn't appear on any local registry, and it hadn't operated under that name in decades. But Nathan knew how these companies worked, rebranding, dissolving, then reforming under new titles, discarding their legal responsibility like old skin. This was no accident. Someone had chosen this place because of how remote it was, because it was protected land, which meant no one lived here full-time, because it had always been viewed as untouchable, until now. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower. "You think they know we found them?" Nathan didn't answer right away. He opened his laptop and began uploading the files to a secure cloud drive he had set up years ago, a habit formed after a close call with an arson investigation in the southern range. He didn't trust physical evidence anymore, not when it involved liability this massive. "They might suspect," he said at last. "Depends how much they're monitoring. But once this hits the state office, and it will, they'll know." Daniel tapped his fingers on the table, then leaned in. "I got a call, not through the station, personal phone, no ID, lasted maybe 10 seconds. Nathan turned toward him sharply. "What did they say?" "Just one thing, a man's voice. He said, 'Stop looking, you've done enough.'" Then the line went dead. Nathan's jaw clenched. He'd expected pushback, but not this soon, not before any formal charges or media attention. That call wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. Someone was watching. Someone knew they were close to unraveling the whole truth. He walked to the storage cabinet, pulled out a battered lockbox, and placed it on the desk. "From now on," he said, "we make copies of everything. 2 drives, 1 off-site, 1 here. We don't talk on open lines, and we don't go anywhere alone." Daniel looked rattled but nodded. He stood to fetch the backup hardware. As he disappeared down the hall, thunder grumbled in the distance. Nathan returned to the window, staring at the trees. Rain had started falling, slow at first, just heavy drops that made the roof creak, then steadily harder. The leaves trembled under the weight, and the river began to blur into the haze. With the rain came a new fear. Contaminants sitting on the soil, pooled in stagnant marshes, would now seep deeper, washing into the underground streams, spreading past their current borders. Rain was nature's solvent. Whatever hadn't moved yet would now begin its journey through the veins of the park. An hour later, the first phone call came. A local ranger from a nearby jurisdiction, voice tight, reported multiple wildlife fatalities within their observation zone. Dead raccoons, fish floating in isolated ponds, birds with scorched feathers and glazed eyes. The symptoms matched what Nathan had seen. The contamination was no longer localized. It had jumped boundaries, found new hosts. The ranger ended the call by asking a question Nathan couldn't answer. "Is this going to stop?" Nathan stared at the silent receiver after the call ended. The rain pounded harder against the glass. He returned to his seat and began writing a detailed incident log, including locations, symptoms, timestamps. He sent it to the state's Department of Environmental Quality, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a small independent watchdog group that specialized in environmental crimes. He attached every photo and video he had, marked them urgent, and copied the files to a drive that Daniel would take off-site. At dusk, the second call came, this time from a local hospital. A nurse, voice anxious, asked about the symptoms they should expect from potential chemical exposure. She said a family had come in with nausea, skin rashes, and severe respiratory distress after returning from a fishing trip on the outer edge of the park. Their dog had died en route. The parents were in stable condition, but their teenage son had been moved to the ICU. Nathan provided what little information he could. He listed symptoms, advised blood testing for dioxins, PCBs, anything in the chlorinated family. The nurse thanked him, and he could hear the tremor in her voice. He knew what she was really asking. Is this going to get worse? Daniel returned just before sunset, his jacket soaked and boots muddy. He carried a hard drive and a paper bag with food neither of them touched. His face was pale. "The signs we put up," he said, "torn down. Southern Pier. Someone cut the tape, removed the hazard boards. I saw a group launching boats. Locals? Maybe. Maybe someone told them it was safe. Or maybe they just didn't care." Nathan stood and moved to the map hanging on the wall. He drew a line from the barrel site to the southern pier, then another downriver to the next community water intake. The distance was closing. Rain would accelerate everything. The contamination wasn't crawling anymore. It was flowing. He looked at Daniel. "We're out of time." That night, the station lights stayed on. Every hour, Nathan radioed updates to any available channel. The park's internal systems continued logging incident reports, but no response came from the state or federal level. It was as if they had been abandoned. At midnight, Nathan stepped outside again. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was thick with mist and the lingering chemical tang. The river gurgled softly in the dark, a constant reminder of its silent betrayal. He walked to the edge and crouched, shining his flashlight on the water. The surface shimmered. A frog sat nearby, motionless, its skin slick with an oily film. Nathan reached out gently and turned it over. It was dead. He buried it in the soft earth with a trembling hand, not because it would help, but because it was the only respectful thing left to do. When he returned to the station, Daniel was asleep on the couch, his breathing shallow. Nathan sat down at the desk, opened his notebook, and began writing. Not just a report, but a record, a confession, a testimony. He wrote everything he had seen, every failure of response, every missed opportunity. He included names, dates, locations. He wrote for the animals that couldn't speak, for the trees whose roots now drank poison, for the people downstream who had no idea what was coming. He didn't know if anyone would read it, but he had to write it anyway, because silence had already done enough damage. And the fear now gripping the community, the fear that nothing would be done, that no one would be held responsible, that fear thrived in silence. He wrote until the sky began to lighten again, until the birds tried to sing but failed, until the air no longer smelled of rain, but of something burned and ancient, something that had awakened and would not go quietly. Outside, the barrels waited beneath the trees, hidden but pulsing. And somewhere beyond the park, men in suits with clean hands and blank eyes slept soundly, still believing their secret had sunk deep enough to stay buried. They were wrong. Nathan had seen it, had touched it, had breathed it. And now he would make sure the world did too. By the early hours of the following morning, the park had transformed into a tense tableau of warning signs, orange hazard tape, and anxious rangers moving between stations like shadows under a dim, pale light. Nathan stood at the edge of the river, the chill of dawn settling into his bones, eyes scanning the water that once seemed so serene, now rippling with thin, oily trails. He could see the evidence everywhere, floating debris coated in a faint sheen, the occasional dead fish bobbing along the surface, and the sallow shapes of birds that had fallen too close to the tainted shore. His heart pounded with anticipation and dread because today would mark the beginning of the public revelation, and there would be no turning back. The hazmat teams had arrived hours ago, their white suits and yellow helmets making them seem like figures from another world intruding upon a natural kingdom. Nathan watched them unload equipment, roll out containment booms, and carry portable testing devices toward the river. He felt a flicker of relief, yet it was tempered by unease. The process would take time, precious hours in which the toxic film could continue spreading. Already, rainwater from last night had carried some of it into adjacent channels, reaching spots where families fished and children played. He thought of the sick children, of the dog that had died, of the small towns downstream that depended on this water for irrigation and drinking. The stakes could not have been higher. Daniel joined him at the riverbank, his expression drawn. He handed Nathan a tablet displaying live data from the hazmat sensors. The readings were staggering. Levels of dioxin and other chlorinated compounds were off the charts, beyond any standard the environmental agencies typically prepared for. Nathan stared at the numbers, feeling a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a spill. It was an active spreading disaster, and it had been deliberately concealed. As the team began testing barrels and water samples, Nathan moved systematically along the riverbank, marking areas where contamination was highest. He photographed everything, documented the placement of each drum, and traced the subtle lines of black liquid trickling into small inlets, connecting points like veins of poison spreading through the landscape. He thought of the warehouse he had discovered, the hidden manifest, the shipping codes. The evidence he had gathered now formed a coherent picture of calculated negligence and greed, a chain that led straight to the companies responsible. By mid-morning, news crews began arriving. Satellite trucks parked along the access roads, cameras trained on the river, and the rangers working along its banks. Nathan felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. The story was no longer his alone. It would be broadcast to thousands, perhaps millions, revealing the extent of the contamination. He guided the journalists carefully, showing only what was safe and instructing them not to cross the hazard tape. Even as he spoke, he couldn't help but notice the people in the crowd, locals, officials, and media alike, all drawn by the spectacle, unaware of the full magnitude of the threat. He returned to the dock to check on a particularly large cluster of barrels. Several had already leaked through, the liquid forming a dark pool that stretched to the water line. Nathan donned his gloves and respirator, carefully lifting one barrel's lid to allow the hazmat sensors to take readings. The instrument beeped furiously, confirming what he had feared. The concentrations were lethal, and the contamination could persist in the sediment for years. He moved to the next barrel, and then the next, methodically ensuring each was monitored. The repetitive motion was exhausting, but he could not stop. Every barrel left unchecked was another potential disaster. Midday came, and a team of independent environmental scientists arrived, carrying lab kits and water analysis equipment. Nathan met them on the riverbank, presenting the documents he had recovered from the warehouse. He laid out the manifests, the photographs, and the notes, explaining what he had observed and tracing the path of the barrels from the warehouse to the northern channel. The scientists nodded gravely, confirming his suspicions. The spill was intentional. The perpetrators had chosen a protected area to avoid detection, and the scope of the damage was unprecedented in recent memory. One of the scientists spoke quietly but firmly. If this were allowed to continue unchecked, the contamination would move downstream into agricultural zones and drinking supplies. The ecological damage alone will take decades to repair. Nathan felt the weight of that statement pressing against his chest. He had known the river was poisoned, but hearing it articulated so clearly by experts with precise measurements made the reality impossible to ignore. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Nathan noticed movement on the river's surface. A bird, wings coated in oil, struggling to take flight. He moved quickly, scooping it into a small net and carrying it to the temporary decontamination area. He worked with a volunteer, gently rinsing the bird, removing debris, and applying treatments. It chirped weakly, but remained alive, a fragile emblem of hope amid the devastation. He returned to the bank, noticing families and journalists standing at a distance, absorbing the scene in stunned silence. The river itself seemed to shiver under the weight of its own contamination. Its normally clear waters now darkened and reflective, rippling with traces of black liquid and oil sheen. Nathan understood that this river, which had once been a sanctuary for generations of wildlife and humans alike, had been irrevocably altered. Yet, he also understood that this exposure, as terrifying as it was, had saved countless lives. By revealing the presence of the barrels and the nature of their contents, he had prevented further harm, had brought attention to an issue that might otherwise have been buried in secrecy. by late afternoon, local authorities arrived, their presence formal and cautious. They inspected the containment measures, questioned Nathan and Daniel, and began documenting the scene for official records. Nathan handed over copies of the warehouse manifests, showing shipping dates, codes, and partial company names. He explained the path of the barrels, the likely chain of distribution, and the evidence of deliberate concealment. The officials listened attentively, scribbling notes, occasionally asking questions about the precise locations of the most heavily contaminated areas. Nathan answered each one in turn, careful not to exaggerate but determined not to minimize the threat. As evening approached, Nathan walked along the riverbank alone for a moment, his reflection caught in the oily ripples. He thought about the barrels, the warehouse, and the invisible network of negligence and greed that had brought them here. He thought about the wildlife, some of which would never recover, and the local communities who had been exposed, even briefly, to toxic substances that could affect them for years. His chest ached, a combination of exhaustion, relief, and a lingering fear that the contamination was far from contained. Yet, amid this gravity, there was an undeniable sense of resolution. The exposure had forced accountability. The hidden crime had been revealed. The evidence Nathan had gathered, combined with the work of the hazmat teams and environmental scientists, ensured that action could finally be taken. The company behind the shipment could no longer hide in the shadows. Investigations would follow, prosecutions would be considered, and at least a measure of justice might be served. Night fell over the park, and the river lay dark and reflective under the rising moon. The wind carried the faint, lingering scent of chemicals, a reminder of the battle still ahead. Nathan sat quietly on the dock, listening to the gentle lap of water against the hull of his patrol boat. The day had been long, exhausting, and filled with moments of fear and uncertainty, but it had ended with something tangible, the beginning of a reckoning. He thought about the small bird now resting in a temporary holding area and smiled faintly. Life persisted, even in the face of a deliberate destruction. And he understood with a deep certainty that his role had not ended here. He would continue to monitor the river, continue to document, continue to protect what remained. The park was wounded, yes, but it still had guardians. As the first stars appeared above the treetops, Nathan made a silent promise to the land and to the river. He would remain vigilant, unwavering in his commitment. The barrels had been exposed, the truth revealed, and the world had begun to see the consequences of greed and neglect. And for the first time in days, Nathan allowed himself to feel a cautious hope, fragile but real, that with continued effort the park and its creatures might endure. The night deepened, the river darkened, and the park seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Nathan remained at the river's edge, watching the water, listening to the soft sounds of nature, and preparing himself for the long journey ahead. There would be cleanup, legal battles, and years of monitoring to come. But for now, the first wave of exposure had done what it needed to do. The secret was out. The guilty could no longer hide, and though the scars on the land and on its wildlife would last, the path toward restoration had begun, illuminated by the painstaking work of a single ranger who refused to remain silent in the face of disaster. If you want to see more unbelievable discoveries like this, make sure to subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Check out our other videos for secrets, mysteries, and shocking finds you won't believe. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let them